In this video, I need your help to help me find the best second-hand dual sport bike for adventure touring. Hello, I'm Francois from adventurebiketroop.com, where we chat about bike riding, maintenance, travel tips and more. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, and for any links we mention in this video, you can find it in the description below. In this video, I want to chat about second-hand, single-cylinder, dual sport bikes, specifically the 650 range. Now these are awesome entry-level bikes if you want to enter the world of adventure riding. So as a first bike, it's fine. Some of them are a bit heavy and a bit high, but if you've been riding commuting bikes or scooters or smaller bikes, it's a nice place to start into the adventure riding world. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's only a starter bike. You can use 650s, and a lot of people use them to ride around the world. So a 650 is really an awesome choice, especially if you don't want to spend a lot of money. If you're cheap like me, then a 650, a second-hand 650 can really take you very far. And if you do a couple of mods, get the luggage, etc., you can really ride across continents on a 650 dual sport bike. Now in this video, I'm going to stick to the bikes that I know the best. So 5 of the bikes that I know best. I've either owned the bikes or I've had friends or have friends that own these bikes and we toured together. So I have a good idea of what they are about. If you have any of these bikes and you agree or disagree or want to add, please pop it in the comments below. And then if you have any of the other 650 bikes in this range, the competitors that I've left out, I'd love to hear from you. Let's help out the guys looking for a 650 dual sport bike. Okay, so let's start with the KLR 650. So I'm going to chat about the generation 1, the first one, the one that's been around since '87 and that they killed in 2007. This, in my mind, I think is the best cheap dual sport bike. And what I love about this bike is it's got that big 23-liter fuel tank. I think it's about 6 point something gallons. And when I bought the KLR, I was looking for a KLR specifically for the big tank, and I didn't know the bikes at all yet. I had an old XT600 that I rode before that. When I got the KLR, I bought this purple and green KLR C model, and I ran out of fuel, and I realized it's only got 14 or 15 liters of fuel. I didn't know there's 2 types, and that was the rarer one. So it was just by chance that I found the C model first. I've never seen one since in real life. And I'm actually sad that I sold it, but I sold it to get the bigger tank of the A model. And so I owned that bike for many years, and we did lots of touring on it, multiple trips to Namibia for 2 weeks, West Coast for 2 weeks. We sped up for a kayak trip, just for a weekend. So I rode that bike everywhere. I commuted on it, on the highway, on the dirt, played around on the farm where I stayed at the time. It was just an awesome bike. And what I like about it is the weight. It's still a heavy bike, but it's lighter than the others that I'm going to mention here. It's got high ground clearance, lots of suspension travel. It's very simple. It's got a simple carburetor. There's not much that can go wrong. And if something goes wrong, it's pretty simple to fix. And there's a lot of aftermarket know-how, especially since this bike's been around for so many decades. You can go to klr.net or any old forum, and there's always lots of help and aftermarket goodies, etc. And there's a lot of cheap mods that you can do yourself as well. And unfortunately, that brings us to the negatives, and there's some necessary mods that you have to do. And it's actually amazing on a bike that's been around so long that they never fixed this. But you all know about the doohickey if you're into KLRs. It's a little, I'm going to explain this wrong, but it's a little lever that tensions the chain, or it keeps the chain tensioned. So as you loosen the bolt, the spring tensions the chain and you tighten it again, and this thing breaks. And if it breaks, the chain will slacken, and all manner of things can go wrong in your engine. And the funny thing is, I asked KLR at the dealership where I bought my bike. I bought a second-hand bike, but it was at 5,000 Ks on the clock. It was pretty new. And I asked them about the doohickey, and they just said, no, it's a myth. There's no such thing. And that's the first thing that I fixed. I went to a specialist that has done this many times, an old German guy. And as we opened the thing, the whole thing came apart. Oh, no, that was another one that he mentioned. He showed me a broken one. Mine didn't even have the spring in it anymore. So they just tightened it. They removed the spring and tightened it. So that means if I had to adjust it, that thing would have came apart and that would have been the end of that engine. So that is really unfortunate on an awesome legend like this that they didn't fix this. But luckily there's Eagle Mic in the US. You can just order the upgraded version and it's pretty easy to install. So that's the one mod that you really have to do, and that's really the Achilles heel of the KLR. Another one is the bolts, especially the subframe bolts. There's an upgrade kit that you can buy. Lots of different places sell these upgrade kits. I did that on mine, so I removed all the bolts that's in this kit and replaced it with Loctite, and I never had any bolts rattle loose after that. Something else that I have to mention is if you really go on the open road at like 90 miles an hour, 140 k's an hour, that's close to, say, between 5,500 6,000 RPM, close to the red line. And the bike still feels good, but it burns oil. So you really need to check your oil level and make sure you check it right. If I remember correctly, there's a glass and you have to it has to be hot, and then it has to stand for 5 minutes or something like that. I can't even remember. But anyways, so just make sure about the oil, because it does burn oil. And I've heard this from many riders, and I've heard of many of the, especially Gen 2 bikes, that seize engines because they didn't check the oil. The cons that I need to mention is the plastics fade. I don't care. I had mine full of stickers. I actually liked it. I had to cable tie those little fairings at the front because they fell off so many times. Some people complain about the seat, that it's uncomfortable. I didn't mind the seat. I mean, we rode through Africa on 2 Chinese delivery bikes, so the KLR was luxury for me. What I like about the flat seat, the bench seat, is you can move around on it in the dirt. So I actually like it, and for luggage, it's perfect. I actually missed mine. I missed both of mine, the C model and the A model, and I was actually looking for another one now. But then I found a Honda XR650L, which I haven't taken delivery of yet, but I'm looking forward to that bike, and it's going to be fun to ride a different type of bike, and it's also a fairly basic bike, or very basic bike. And then just one other thing that's a big negative of the KLR is, well, the Gen 2 KLR. It was just a horrible bike. I rode it a couple of times. It rides nice, but all those plastics and I just don't like it. If you crash the bike, it's going to cost you a lot of money. The next bike that I want to chat about is the BMW F650 Funduro. So this was a bike in the mid-90s. They took a road bike and put long travel suspension and spoke wheels on it, and they called it the Funduro. Now, a lot of people laugh at this bike. It looks like it looks like a road bike. It's similar to the Aprilia Pegaso that you had back then. But there's a couple of people that has put on knobblies and toured through the desert. I think there's a lady, Benka Polko, that rode hers around the world for a couple of years. Now, we bought this bike. It had very low mileage. I think it was 5,000 miles. It was imported from Japan. And my wife was looking for a bike after a trip we did around South Africa on small 125cc bikes. She wanted to ride her own bike. So we looked around, and this was the only bike we could find at a good price, low mileage, that she could put her feet right on the ground. It's a low seat height, and that is really a big plus for a lot of beginner riders or shorter riders. I want to say lady riders, but they're short guys as well. And I remember this was an awesome bike to ride. It was easy in the dirt because of that low seat height. You could easily dab your boot if necessary. It was quite economical, more than my KLR, which was awesome. I think it was a bit of riding style, but the bike itself with twin carbs, it was actually very reliable, because you don't open the throttle all the way if you're touring relaxed. And so that was nice. It got a tall screen, so with this low seat height and this tall screen, you're really out of the wind and the elements. So even in the rain, light rain, you don't get as wet. And we did a weekend trip with friends, and it was snowing that weekend. And that actually helps a lot, because the engine heats up your legs, and you've got the tall screen, low seat, so that is awesome. Then on the road, it's got awesome road manners with that 19-inch front wheel, so it feels like a road bike in the corners, but then when you go off-road, it can handle it. A big downside of this bike, it's quite heavy. It feels top heavy. It feels much heavier than the KLR that I had. So if you drop the bike, it just feels more difficult to pick up as well. And Um, I don't like the dual carbs. It's just one more thing that can go wrong, and if you need to clean it out, yeah, that is it's a negative for me, but it does work well when it works. And then another negative is that 19-inch front wheel when you do go off road. So over rocky terrain in the sand, it helps to have a larger diameter wheel. But all in all, I loved the Funduro, and after I sold my KLR, I still rode the Funduro for quite a bit. And the owner actually phoned or sent me a text years later, and he put, I think, something like 35,000 miles on it by then, and the bike was still running perfectly. So that was an awesome bike. Now in 2000, BMW brought out the F650 GS. And you had the standard GS version with the 19-inch front wheel, same as the Funduro. And then there was the Dakar version with a 21-inch front wheel. Now, this was a lovely bike. I didn't own one. A friend of mine owned one, and we toured together. And I remember getting on this bike. It feels light. It feels nimble. It's got the tank below the seat, so the center of gravity is low. Even though the bike weighs more than the KLR, it felt much lighter because of that low center of gravity. It's got fuel injection, so that's awesome. It feels nippy, and I think there was initially there's a mention of surging problems, and they fixed that with the twin spark model. So the one I rode was a 2004, and that didn't have any problems at all. It just, I remember riding up this rocky hill, and it just felt light. You could stand on the pegs, and it was just a comfortable bike to ride. Nice thing about it, it's got ABS, and you can switch the ABS off with the button. And that 21-inch front wheel, it's got higher ground clearance than the standard 650 GS or the Funduro, so it's more off-road. It's more of an off-road machine, and the fuel economy is awesome on that bike. I remember, yeah, the range that he got on his bike was way more than the rest of us. Downside of this bike is the ABS button was a bit fiddly. I remember I couldn't switch off the ABS. Maybe there was just something wrong with that bike, but I thought it's off, and then as you brake it, you feel it's still on, and you had to stop again. And I just remember I fiddled with that a bit. And I mentioned that because I had to mention something. There's not much else I can mention. And if you really need another con, it's, I don't know, not everyone is into the BMW image. It's a stupid reason to say not to like a bike. But anyway, so, and this is actually a bike that was on my shortlist for my next bike, along with the KLR. The Dakar is really an awesome bike if you can find a good one. The Yamaha XT600E Tenere looks a bit out of place in this crowd, but it's a newer bike, and it's more expensive. But it's not the most powerful. It's very similar. The power specs is very similar to the other 650 bikes in this video. So I'm going to include it here, and two of my friends had Teneres, and I've ridden them a couple of times. And on both big tours that we did, the Teneres went with. There was at least one. So I've got a bit of a feeling of the bike, and it's actually very comparable to the other bikes, even though it's more expensive. So one thing that I really like about the Tenere is the looks. It just looks aggressive. It looks like an adventure bike, like a Dakar racer. And that is awesome. It's got very low down torque. I think it's got the most torque of the bikes on my list. You can check out post in the description below at adventurebikegroup.com, where I've got all the specs of all the 650s I could think of, and if there's any bikes I left out, please mention it in the comments below, and I'll go and update that list. Now, like I said, the specs are very comparable to the rest of the bikes here, apart from the price, because it's a newer bike. What I also like about this is the way it delivers the torque low down. So when you pull the throttle, it just lifts the front wheel super easy. So we had fun on an old airstrip where we just popped wheelies, and I'm not a wheelie guy at all, but the friend of mine showed me, and it was just so easy. You just crack open the throttle and it lifts the front wheel. We did a drag race with my KLR, this 660Z, the Tenere, and the Dakar, the 2004 Dakar. And every time, we did a couple of runs, every time the KLR won. Now, I am a bit lighter than the other riders, but the KLR is lighter, and it is just, it revs nice and freely. So I was very surprised. I thought, well, with the two EFI bikes, this carved KLR will definitely be last. It has taller gearing, so the top speed might be a little faster. And I remember riding behind my buddies whose bike it was, He was on a CBR 600RR that I was testing, and I was trying to stay with him, and I saw 170 kilometers per hour on the speedo. Now, it's obviously just an indicated speed, but it did move if you give it enough time. The bikes are unbreakable, and I can attest to this because this is one of my best friends, has an XT, and he bought it in 2010 or 2011. It's got 84,000 kilometers on the clock now, and he's really... the bike works hard. He pops wheelies and drives in places you shouldn't drive and power slides, and he's really hard on the bike, and he's a heavy guy with loads up his luggage, and the bike's still doing fine after 84,000 kilometers. He once stripped the whole bike and painted the frame yellow and rebuilt the bike, but it's still the original engine. Nothing has been opened up. Off-road, it's an awesome bike. It's got a long travel suspension, high ground clearance, and it's just an awesome bike off-road. It's got good brakes, much better brakes than any of the other bikes here. Bigger discs, twin discs up front, because it's a modern bike. No ABS, that is quite nice on a bike like this, especially for off-road riding, and it's got a big tank. Then stuff that I don't like about this bike: it's expensive to get second-hand. People don't want to let them go. If you can find one, you're going to pay quite a bit, at least where I live. It's not the fastest bike, so if you want a faster bike, this is not the one, even though it seems like it must be faster than the other old, more primitive 650s. It's got a tall seat height, so if you're a little bit shorter legs, you're going to struggle on this bike, but if you're a bit more comfortable, awesome bike off-road. And then not much else. I mean, there's very little you can fault on the 660Z. So the last bike on our list that I'm going to chat about is a weird one. It's the Suzuki DR750 Big, or Dr. Big, as some people call it, or the Desert Express. Now, the reason I'm chatting about the DR750 Big and not the DR650 SE is because I never owned a 650 SE, and I didn't know anyone that owned one. I know this is a super popular bike in the US, but I managed to find a DR750 Big. I immediately loved the look of the bike and how it sounded and the way it rode. So I bought the bike. I had the KLR, so I bought the DR750 Big with the idea of selling the old ugly KLR. But 2 weeks later, I sold the DR again, or I swapped it for an XJ6 old Jag. Silly mistake. But anyways, I swapped it and kept my KLR. So let's chat about the DR750 Big. A friend of mine also bought one during that same time, and he ended up riding it for quite a few months. Took it to Namibia with us as well, with his wife on the back, all his luggage. I think later on a trip he actually broke his frame. Not on that trip, but on a later trip, he broke his frame. They had to weld it with a piece of rebar in place to brace it. Anyways, it's an old bike, old heavy bike. What I liked about the bikes, the image. It just looks like it's straight from the Dakar Rally. It's got a big 29-liter tank. It's split into two, so when you remove the tank, you have two pieces. It's a bit awkward and to do on your own. I like the fact that it's rare. It's a lot of people hasn't even seen a DR750 Big yet. So wherever you go, people pay attention to this old bike. I think it was important to Canada, but North America, I don't think so. I might be wrong. But I think a couple made it as grey import. So if you can find one, it's an awesome bike. I like it that it's got a lot of space. It's got a flat bench seat again. So with all your luggage and stuff, it's easy to fit it on there. Negatives, there's quite a long list. It's big, it's heavy, it's old. They only made it for a couple of years. Then they upped it to 800cc single cylinder, and then they canned it. Had a rear drum brake. The electrics was a bit funny. That was the Achilles heel of most of the DRs, that neutral cutout switch. I just remember mine left me stranded so many times, and that's why I ended up swapping it for an even worse thing, an old British car, a Jag. It had an old decompression lever. Mine didn't properly work, that you had to pull before you started because of that big cylinder. And it was air cooled, not necessarily a bad thing, but yeah, it didn't have liquid cooling. Yeah, I loved the idea of it, but living with it, the KLR was just so much better, and I couldn't get it over my heart to sell the KLR and keep this old thing. So that's the list of 5 bikes that I've owned or spent some proper time with over the years, and all great bikes. My choice is still I love the Tenere. That's an awesome bike, but at the price, I think the KLR for me is an also I think I've just got a soft spot for it. Dakar also an awesome bike for almost the same price as an old KLR, and because the people love the KLR so much. I'm going to quickly mention a couple of other bikes that I've also ridden over the years and knew people that own them. The first one is the XT600E. Also a dual carbs. It's a lighter bike, lighter than any of the 5 that we mentioned. Slower bike, but it's smaller. Off-road, it's awesome, but you can still tour. One of my friends, he's quite a big guy, but he toured 2 weeks with his wife on the back with all their luggage through Namibia, no problems at all. So it's an awesome little bike and very, very reliable. Then the BMW F650 GS, the standard one. So this is sort of in between the Funduro, because it replaced the Funduro. It's got EFI, fuel injection, and so in between the Funduro and the Dakar. The Dakar was the same bike, but with bigger wheel up front, spoked rims. Well, they both had spoked rims. For some reason, I actually prefer the Funduro and the Dakar more than the one in the middle, the GS. I don't know, maybe it's just the image thing. But anyways, it's still an awesome bike, and with knobblies on and a luggage rack, you can go anywhere on an old GS. Then the old Yamaha XT500. I know it's an old dirt bike, but mine had a nice luggage rack at the back that the previous owner welded on. He lifted the rear suspension, and I did it. And I fitted a 35-liter fuel tank, a huge tank. I could do 700 kilometers on that old XT, so nothing to scoff at. And we also did a trip once. It was I think it was about 8 days. It's quite thick sand in the west coast, and 2 of my friends rode XT500s on that trip. I had the KLR, like a super modern bike compared to their XTs, and they fared completely fine. It was easy to pick up. The bikes had a lot of torque. You can do 100 kilometers per hour on the dirt roads, no problem. So at all the XT500, it's almost impossible to kill it. Mine, I really neglected my bike. I had a 500 as well, and it just never died. And then finally, the second generation KLR, the 2008 onwards. It's not the worst bike, and I almost thought of getting myself one, but it's just a disliked bike compared to the old one. But nothing wrong with it. It's still basically the same bike, little bigger carburetor, a little better suspension, little better brakes, a lot more plastics, just uglier bike. But yeah, it's still a KLR. And then 3 bikes that I've never owned or ridden before that I'd love to hear from you is the DR750 SE, very popular in the US especially. The KTM 640, it just looks like an awesome bike, and everyone says it's an awesome travel bike. I know there's a lot of issues around KTM reliability, and one of my friends had one, and I never rode the bike because it always stood in the garage. It just never rode, and then he sold it and to replace it with a 990 Adventure. So I never got the chance because the bike would never run. And then finally the Honda XR650L, and that is one bike that I'm super excited to get my hands on fairly soon. So we'll feature that on this channel as soon as we can. Please let me know if you have any of these bikes, if you disagree with anything, if you have more to add on any of the bikes I mentioned, or the other ones, or the ones I left out. And please consider subscribing to this channel. Thank you, and goodbye.